Well, if you're just joining us, we have a developing story. It is the alleged BBC sex scandal. We were on the edge of our seats as to where the Sun would go from here. Were they going to back down after lawyers representing the alleged victim said the story is not true? Well, the Sun have roared back into life and have restarted this great debate because they have just reported that the stepfather of the young person involved in the alleged BBC sex scandal gave the Beeb screenshots of contact between their child and the star and bank statements proving payments 7 weeks ago, not on Thursday. He said, "We put the allegations to them for an hour, but the presenter remained on air and was not even spoken to until the Sun contacted the BBC last week." Astonishing stuff. So the Sun doubling down. This story is not going anywhere. I'm joined now by Mark Williams-Thomas, the top cop who helped expose Jimmy Savile. Mark, has the corporation learned no lessons from Savile?
Good evening, Mark. Yeah, I mean, what a debacle we're in. We're in a situation where the story has now become again about the BBC, and exactly the same happened with Savile after my expose of Savile. You know, I stepped away for 2 weeks because I just wanted to see what happens, and the BBC imploded exactly as they have done again now. Let's be very clear, you know, when the Sun got their information, they did a real amount of checks to make sure that what they were going to print with was evidence. And of course, we're now seeing them responding in respect of that. We've had two major developments today. We've had the child themselves, or so the young person, I should say now, come out and say that the story is not accurate. But then we've had the parents, both the mother and the stepfather, who say that actually they stand by their account. And of course, we've had the Sun who have now said they stand by their account. The problem is that the Sun of the BBC have had this story now for a considerable period of time, almost 50 days. And it took the Sun to do their publication for the BBC to take the matter seriously, to suspend. I called for the suspension of the individual on Saturday night. They were suspended on Sunday. And of course, we've now learned, because the Sun have come out very clearly today, saying that actually we gave them a certain amount of information and they've had some sight of that. And indeed, the individual was still on air. What they should have done is taken the allegation, suspended the individual once they'd done a fair amount of checks initially, which takes a matter of days, and then allowed the inquiry to be conducted. But what they've done is they've actually knuckled down, tried to do everything to try to allow the individual to carry on and cover the story up. And of course, the matter of the story is now out. You'd think the BBC would learn, because it's always going to get out. And so is, in fact, the individual's name. And the next big question, and I wrote about this today, the next big question is, at what point is he going to be named?
Well, should he be named?
Well, I think we've got a situation now where, for the respect of the other BBC presenters, who themselves have had to come out and actually say that it's not them, we've got an individual who has hankered down, who at this position in time is not going to say something. The BBC would, I think, probably want him to say something. I think the next stage we're going to have is, I can't see any of the newspapers, any of the broadcasters naming him. We're in the same situation as we were with Rolf Harris to a similar degree. Obviously, there was no criminal investigation at this moment in time in relation to the individual, but there certainly was in relation to Rolf Harris. As I named Rolf Harris, and it took the press a very long time before they followed and actually publicly put that name out there. I think what will happen is that the individual themselves in due course will probably come out either directly or through a third party, their lawyer, to say something, or potentially there may be an MP who takes the position that in the House they're going to say something. I can't see any broadcaster, but let's be very clear. The public know exactly who this person is, or the large majority of the public, because their name has been spread so widely across social media.
Mark Williams-Thomas, I wonder about this. Are we overreacting? Is it a storm in a teacup, given the fact that you're talking about a 17-year-old, so that's above the age of consent for a sexual activity? Is it really crime of the century if it were proven that this had happened, that this star had procured photos from a 17-year-old?
Well, let's be very clear. There is a criminal offence for anyone under the age of 18. to be engaged in any sexual photographs. So indecent photographs are of a person under the age of 18. So if they were 17 and they were sending indecent photographs, that is a criminal offence. So, and of course, it's a criminal offence the other way around as well, to send those photographs to someone under the age of 18.
If you can have sex with somebody that's 16, it's a bit arcane, isn't it? It's a bit old-fashioned that you can't send a picture of yourself naked at the age of 17. Perhaps the law's an ass.
No, I don't think it is. I think that the law has changed more recently to deal with the aspect of indecent photographs of those people who are under the age of 18. So I think the law is appropriate. You could question whether or not the age of consent is appropriate. But of course, that's a matter for a huge debate. The reality is, this individual, whether or not they've committed a criminal offence, this individual, they've proved to be correct, certainly has abused their position of trust. And let's be very clear, the BBC is an iconic organisation to which the public trust. Up and down through generations, the trust has varied. And of course, more recently, that trust has been lost because of a certain amount of things, none more so than my Jimmy Savile investigation. And I think when you look at the type of individual to whom this allegation is against, again, this is an individual who holds an incredibly high profile position within the BBC. So I think what we've got now is we've got a story that's very sadly, because of the inept and the inability for the BBC to just deal with a situation as it presents itself appropriately, we've now got the story turned that it's become a story about the BBC rather than a story about a potential abuse by one of the BBC members of staff.
Briefly, Mark, if you can, do you think this issue at the Beeb, given your intimate knowledge of the organisation, do you think in relation to how they've handled this, is it a culture of denial that they just cannot process the scale of what may have happened from one of their big stars, that we're allegedly told it is? Or is it a cover-up? Do you think darker forces at work in relation to the BBC?
No, it's so similar to what happened with Savile in the months prior, or in the month prior to Savile. We wrote to the Director General asking them for an interview in respect to Savile. They came back and said there's no questions to answer. There's no allegations that have ever been made. As it got into the press and the story got bigger and bigger in the days leading up to, they kept changing their right to reply. Indeed, so much so that on the morning of the Savile expose, I had to re-record a new right to reply because they gave a different response. They've done exactly the same. There is a huge separation between on-the-ground journalists and senior managers, and that separation still exists, where they refuse to accept often the advice that's being given to them. It's quite simply that. The reality is safeguarding investigations happen up and down the country. They've got this wrong.
They've got it wrong. There's an issue of the culture of the Beeb, which you say hasn't changed. Is it a cover-up by the BBC?
I think it's inept. I think that to be used cover-up is a very strong word. What I would say is that they have failed to follow process. And as a result of that, they've now got themselves into a position where they have done further damage to their credibility.
Mark, thank you
as an organisation.
So
as John Sargent says, they're not going to go. But the reality is they have to have public confidence, and they're losing it again because of their ability to deal with something that's very simply in the wrong way.
Mark, brilliant to have you on the show. I wish we had longer. My thanks to Mark Williams-Thomas, top investigative journalist. The BBC have said in a statement at the weekend, new allegations were put to us on Thursday of a different nature. And in addition to our own inquiries, we've also been in touch with external authorities in line with our protocols. Contradicting what Mark has had to say there. What do you think, Mark, at gbnews.com, and Dan at gbnews.com? Both emails work.